Hey, welcome to a brief history of transformative learning theory. My name is Chad Hoggan. I'm an associate professor here at North Carolina State University. I am also one of the editors of the Journal of Transformative Education. I'm a huge fan of transformative learning theory. I've read a lot about it in the literature. I use it in the research that I do, and I just think about it a lot, to be honest. Yeah, and I think there's a lot of good to be had here for someone looking for a theory to help explain and understand some significant change that happens in the lives of adults. I would like in this presentation to talk about a history of kind of the evolution of the theory from my perspective. Now, any history that anybody makes is always incomplete and skewed and all that, and mine certainly will be. These are just things that I notice and that I think are important to understand in terms of using the theory now. So, what to expect from this presentation? One, I'm going to give a brief history and overview of Mezerow's theory of perspective transformation. Real high-level view, just highlighting some parts of it that I think are really important. And then I want to transition into kind of the evolution of that theory. And then I want to talk about some research I did a few years ago, research on the literature, analyzing what I saw in this evolution of the theory, and from that, some definitions and criteria for the theory, and a typology of transformative learning outcomes, or typology of transformative outcomes. So, to begin, perspective transformation was coined by Jack Mezerow based on a study he did back in the 70s. He published it on this in 1978. The study was based on women enrolled in return-to-work programs in community colleges across the United States. And he was part of a grant that was supposed to be doing an evaluation of those programs. And keep in mind, this was taking place during the women's liberation movement of the 1970s. So basically, Jack Mezerow, he fulfilled the requirements of the grant, and he said, and he and Victoria Marsick and others on the project said, there's just more going on here than just the curricular learning that is listed on the syllabus and on the grant and stuff like that. And so he approached this, by the way, from a background of social constructivism, meaning that adults kind of create their own reality, but the way we do it is profoundly shaped by our social surround. And he also approached it from a critical theory perspective, although that part of it kind of came in a little bit later, not necessarily in his original study. Anyway, so he called it perspective transformation, and then in some of his early writings, he referred to it as transformation theory, and then he started calling it transformative learning. Probably one of the most famous parts of this is he said there are 10 phases that people often go through in the process of transformation. To be fair, he never said that everybody goes through every phase. He never said they were sequential, strictly speaking, or that it was a clean process. He didn't say anything like that, and sometimes people critique him because he came up with a phase. I find it useful to think of these 10 phases as 10 types of experiences that people commonly have when they're going through this kind of major life dilemma. So it very famously begins with a disorienting dilemma. I'm not going to dwell on these because if you want to learn more about Mezerow, I highly recommend going elsewhere for it. I'm just trying to give just an overview of it. But basically, a disorienting dilemma, people start experiencing things that don't make sense according to their way of understanding the world, and it causes a lot of consternation, disorientation, and it kind of initiates a process. So number two, they engage in a self-examination, and they experience these profound feelings of guilt and shame. They start critically assessing their assumptions that seem to be incorrect about themselves, about the world, about the way things work. He said an important part of the process is that they recognize that this is a shared experience, that they're not uniquely weird, that other people have gone through this before. In the fifth step, he said at some point, there has to be an exploration of of new roles, relationships, actions, new possibilities. There's a kind of a planning of what am I going to do. I've been thinking through things, exploring options. What does this mean for me? At some point, they need to acquire knowledge and skills for enacting whatever this big change in their life is. 8, I think, is really important. He said, they take on new social roles, new positionalities, and it feels like they're just kind of provisionally trying it on just to see if it sticks and how it feels. Slowly, they build competence and self-confidence, and then at some point, they reintegrate into life. Meaning they at some point come a new kind of a new sense of what is normal. So, as I said, he called it by those several terms, but it kind of, all this kind of begs the question of when Mezirow was talking about transformation, what does that mean exactly? And he was actually really specific about this, and I think it's important to appreciate exactly what he said. He said, transformative learning refers to the process by which we transform our taken for granted frames of reference. So when he talked about frames of reference, he means these are structures of understanding. They're kind of these mental models for how we see ourselves, how we think the world is, how we think the world works, all these kind of things. And he said these are formed throughout childhood, profoundly influenced by our parents, by our neighborhood, by the church we went to, by the era that we lived in. All these kind of things influence it. He said that childhood is a time of formation, and that's when these frames of reference are formed. He said, by the way, that adulthood is a time for transformation because it's only in adulthood that we develop the cognitive capacities to actually engage in this kind of metacognitive thinking about our own thinking. Now, he said quite a bit more about frames of reference, introducing terms such as meaning, perspectives, habits of mind, mindsets, all good stuff. Highly recommend you go read about them if you want. But he said, not only do we look at them, transformative learning involves changing them in a way that made them more inclusive, more discriminating, more open, more emotionally capable of change, and reflective. So, he's saying it's not just that people change in dramatic ways. It's that they develop understandings, worldviews, ways of thinking and acting and everything else that is, one, more inclusive. Meaning, it's not so narrowly understood as based on your own unique life, but it is capable of making sense of a wider variety of perspectives, of experiences, etc. He said it's more discriminating, meaning that instead of just accepting everything we were taught in our youth, that we actually evaluate and make critical decisions about things. In the 1970s, many people were brought up thinking that a woman's place was in the home, and then, in his studying, he saw women that said they were questioning that, saying, "Well, my children are grown and gone, whatever, but I don't want to be in the home. I want a career." And for somebody to engage in critical reflection about these taken for granted assumptions about gender roles means that you're more discriminating in the assumptions that you hold. More open. I think of that in terms of being open-minded, open to new possibilities for understanding and conceptualizing things. More emotionally capable of change, which is interesting. It implies here that when you engage in this process and you realize that all these assumptions and understandings you had about the world were limited and some of them were incorrect and you don't agree with them, that now you hold your new understandings, your frames of reference, a little less tightly, where you're more open-minded about yourself being wrong, about how these might need to change again in the future. So you become more emotionally capable of change and more reflective. So we evaluate our understandings of ourselves and the world, and we gain maybe more of a disposition in the future to think back and question what we think we know to be true. And the point of all this is that we generate beliefs and opinions that are better. Or as he said, they're more true, or if nothing else, they're more justified to guide how you live your life. Carrying on, and this is the last slide on this definition, I promise. Its focus, transformative learning's focus, is how we learn to negotiate and act on our own purposes, values, feelings, and meanings. So rather than live a life dictated by the unique social influences of your childhood, it's about becoming more self-directed, about deciding for ourselves what's important to us and how we're going to feel about things and the meaning we're going to ascribe to things, rather than just those, as he says, that we've uncritically assimilated from others. And so by doing all this, we gain greater control of our own lives, and we become more socially responsible, clear-thinking decision makers. And I would add to that this is what's so important for those of us who live in a supposedly open, free, pluralistic, democratic society, is we need people that really think about their views and are thoughtful, socially responsible. People who are like that can still disagree on issues, but it's a different kind of disagreement. And I think it just makes for better democratic citizens. Okay, so that's what Mezirow basically said. And again, I'm not really doing him justice here. But one thing he did was really interesting. He published that in 1978, and for a good 10 years, nobody really responded to it in the literature. And then in the early 90s, a couple scholars published articles, acknowledging the great work that he did, but critiquing it in some ways. And it kind of, in my mind, it seems like there was like some kind of renewed, not even renewed, but a new kind of interest in it. And so then later on in the late 90s, the first Transformative Learning Conference was held, and he purposely invited well-known scholars that were writing about something kind of similar to what he talked about, and he invited them to the conference and asked them to say, basically, what is transformative learning to you based on the work you do? Well, one important contributor there was John Dirks. I'm going to cover a couple of them to make a point. But this has been a very influential influence on people's understandings of transformative learning. So John Dirks said, the process that Mezirow described doesn't resonate with the kind of transformations that I think about. Now, he was building on Carl Jung's model of the psyche. So Jung was like a contemporary of Freud, and he has a somewhat similar model of what is the human psyche. There's the consciousness, the unconscious, and yada yada. And in Jungian psychology, there's in adulthood, I think Carl Jung talked about it in terms of a midlife crisis, I think. But he basically said, you hit a certain age, and many people start feeling a necessity to be more authentic, where parts of themselves that they have held down because maybe they were not socially acceptable or whatever start bubbling up. And by confronting those images and those feelings and everything that arise, and wrestling with them and accepting them and figuring out what they mean, you become more authentic, more whole. So John Dirks kind of, he works with that, and I think he's veered from Jung, strictly speaking, where he doesn't think it's just a midlife phenomenon, but he focuses on the importance of paying attention to one's inner worlds. And again, by being present with one's emotions, by paying attention to fantasies, to dreams, things like that. And through this process that I think Jung would have called individuation, you become more self-aware, you live a more authentic life. All right, so I think it's for me, it's easy to see that what John Dirks is talking about is definitely transformative. Like I can see how that would make somebody experience life in a profoundly different way than they did before. But it's certainly something very different than what Mezirow was talking about. One, he's not really talking in terms of critical self-assessment of your assumptions. He's not talking about mindsets that are more discriminating and stuff like that. He's just kind of talking about a different phenomenon, but one that seems to be transformative. All right, example number 2. Also at that initial Transformative Learning Conference, Bob Keegan from Harvard was there. He has a very famous psychodevelopmental model. So it's a model of development that encompasses childhood and adulthood. He was building on the work like of Piaget, but Piaget focused only on childhood. And I don't want to go into the details of his model. I think it's fantastic. Highly recommend you go read his stuff. But in essence, he said, adults are able to advance cognitively, if you will. He talked in terms of changing their forms of knowing, where things that used to form part of who you are, you wouldn't even be aware of them, you realize are not actually who you are, and so therefore they move from being the subject, being behind your lens, so to speak, to being object, something that you actually could look at and say, oh, there's that. So one example he gives is people, let's say in their teenage years, whose social relationships, because of their stage of development, are integral to their sense of who they are. And what he would say is that therefore teenagers don't have relationships, they are their relationship. And then most people, sometime, let's say in the 20s or whenever, kind of advance beyond that. And so the relationships they have no longer form part of who they are. Now they can hold the relationships up and look at them and appreciate them for what they are, and they're no longer subject to them. So he would say you really can't have healthy relationships, good relationships, if you're subject to them. It's only when you move past that you can genuinely have relationships. So that's just one example, but what he's getting at here is this kind of refined sense, in my mind, of identity. Again, he talks about in terms of forms of knowing, but this a refinement of what I used to assume was me without realizing I was assuming it. There were these things that formed a part of just who I thought I was, and therefore how I saw the world, and then having that wrenched away, sometimes very painfully, when you realize, oh, that wasn't me. I'm something other than that. All right, so here's my point. After a while, we had different scholars, such as Dirks and Keegan, who said, here are things, phenomena of people changing in dramatic ways in adulthood that are arguably transformative. And Mesereau took a lot of these presentations from the conference and made an edited book out of it. And in a way, he was tacitly agreeing and saying, yeah, these are legit forms of transformation going on here, but they are different from each other. They're kind of talking about different phenomena in some ways. So Ed Taylor did a review of the literature and over time kind of named what some of these different approaches to transformative learning were. So whereas originally Mesereau came up with perspective transformation and he started calling it transformative learning, now other people were using transformative learning, even though technically they weren't using the same theory that he developed. They were talking a little bit more broadly about transformation. So we have the psychodevelopmental perspective, such as what Dirks had. We had the psychoanalytic perspective, such as what Bob Keegan was. But there were others: social emancipatory, neurobiological, cultural spiritual. There were other perspectives as well. So we have scholars, if you will, contributing to the theory of transformative learning. But they weren't. I mean, because they weren't really creating addendums to Mesereau's work. They were offering alternative ways of understanding separate from Mesereau's work. And that's an important distinction, because a criticism, so there's big circles, but then there's tons of smaller ones too. So then a criticism started being laid against transformative learning theory, and that is, it's not really a theory at all. It's just like a whole hodgepodge of people saying stuff. It gets to the point where everything's transformative learning. And you actually can find articles, in my mind, where the author was calling something transformative learning, and I was looking specifically at, how did that person change? You're like, how is that transformation? And there were some times where I would get the sense that, yeah, I think that criticism is true. You're just kind of calling whatever it is, whatever you want it to be, transformation. All right. So this is the dilemma of transformative learning. We have this term called perspective transformation that Mesereau came up with. He defined it very, very explicitly. I mean, that was what we started off at the beginning of this presentation talking about. This is how people change. We're talking about their meaning perspectives, becoming more inclusive, etc. He even came up with, this is the process by which they go through, blah, blah, blah. But then other people started pitching in with their ideas of transformation. And so the term transformative learning came to be used to refer to perspective transformation, but also to all these other approaches. And so the danger here, the danger is that of evacuation. If a term is used to refer to everything, then it means nothing. So, yeah. So a few years ago, I was thinking about this, and over a period of time, it occurred to me that really what I should do, what needed to be done, was to create some kind of framework to talk about how people change in dramatic ways. Because it seemed to me that if I had to say what was the connector between all these different approaches to transformative learning, if the connector wasn't Mesereau's specific theory of perspective transformation, it's just, what is it? Well, it was transformation. And by transformation, it seemed to me that they meant, in some ways, that people learned in a way that was somehow more profound, more dramatic, more impactful than what we would consider other forms of learning. And we needed, I felt, to start there in order to get to a place where we could say, tell you what, here's what transformative learning is. Here's what it is. Therefore, here's what it's not. And until we did this problem of evacuation was just going to keep on getting worse and worse and worse. So very briefly, not to bore you too much with this, but basically me and I had 2 doctoral students helping with this. We went to the 3 primary adult education journals in North America, which are Adult Education Quarterly, Adult Learning, Journal of Transformative Education, because it seemed to me that that's where most articles on transformative learning had been published. We went back over an 11-year time period from 2003 to 2014, and I did that specifically because Mesereau's book came out in 2000, and that's where all these different approaches really kind of started coming out. And so I wanted to give just 3 years for the book to get well enough known and for people to write articles, get them published, so that I would have something to look at. Because I wasn't wanting just to dwell on only Mesereau's work from the 1990s. So in those 3 journals, in that time period, we came up with 213 articles. And what we did was we looked at every article and we said, how was this researcher, this scholar, how were they defining transformation? If somebody changed in a dramatic way, what did that mean here? And I'll give you one example. There's this top quote is from Edmund O'Sullivan, where he said that transformative learning involves experiencing a deep structural shift in the basic premises of thought, feelings, and actions. It's a shift of consciousness that dramatically and permanently alters our ways of being in the world. And so as we looked at that for our study, and we said, well, he's saying that a transformation involves, and then we took his definition and just broke it out. He said a shift in basic premises of thought. He said a shift in feelings, in actions, in consciousness, and in altered ways of being in the world. And that's how we coded it. And we went through all 213 articles looking for some kind of definition they gave about what transformation entailed. And I'll get to this in more detail in just a little bit, but basically we came up with, I want to say we had 1,023 coded excerpts, and then when we coded them down, it came to something like 23 codes or 27 codes, something like that. And then I looked at those codes and realized you could probably clump them together into 6 broad categories of themes. So basically, when people talked about learners changing in dramatic ways, there were 6 broad ways they changed, and within each of these broad ways, there were also some maybe more specific ways they changed. It occurred to me as well, though, when I looked at that, I'm like, well, let's say a change in worldview. So if I think differently about anything, you could argue that I just experienced a change in worldview. Having a change of worldview does not mean that whatever it was I experienced was transformative. Same thing with self, with epistemology, with all those categories. It's not how, the specific way you change that makes a difference. In my mind, it had to be like really impactful. If we're going to say it was transformative, what does this mean? And through the course of analyzing all these research articles, it seemed to me that there's an issue of depth, of how much did it impact you? This new worldview, for instance. Was it a tiny little thing that you're like, oh yeah, that's something neat, okay. Or is it big, like, oh my gosh, I thought the world was a cube floating through space, but it's actually a sphere. That's amazing. I mean, whatever. But, so was it really impactful? And then it also occurred to me that a change in any or all of these things that only affected me in one context. Let's say I was enrolled in school, and because I was immersed in the higher education environment in a particular class with a particular teacher, I started thinking differently. But when the class ended, I just, I went back to normal. Or when I went home that night, or when I went and hung out with my buddies that weekend, I didn't continue to think in those ways. I reverted back to my normal ways of thinking. So it seemed to me that to say that something was transformative, it would kind of have to impact a lot of, if not all, of the contexts of one's life, not just specific to one thing. All right. So, yeah. So what I was looking at is I'm thinking that for it to be transformative learning, these are like my initial thoughts, it's got to be down here in the lower right quadrant, right? It's got to have a deep impact and go across a lot of contexts of one's life. So, something like that. At the end of the study, I was looking at all these codes, looking at all these studies of people describing different ways that people change in dramatic ways. And so one of my goals was to based on this, how would I define transformative learning? And a couple things occurred to me. The first, it seemed to me that to say that somebody transformed, it would need to be some kind of significant and irreversible change in the way that person experienced the world, the way they conceptualized the world, the way they interacted with the world. So significant is me referring to that issue of depth. Irreversible refers to the issue of, when the class ends, do I go back, or am I like this for the rest of my life? Or if nothing else, a person may change yet again in the future, but is there at least some kind of what I call relative stability here? And then it seemed to me that this change would be in some way that the person experiences the world, meaning on a moment-to-moment basis, what is their felt experience? How are they making sense of the world moment to moment, right? The second one is how they conceptualize the world, meaning this is how they envision the world to be, and this, the worldviews and things like that. And then lastly, how do they interact with the world? Does it change their behavior? So I'm going to get a minute to breaking those things down in more detail. But it seemed to me that for something to be called transformative learning, that, in my mind, would suffice. That's my definition for it. It had to result in significant and irreversible change in the way a person experiences, conceptualizes, and interacts with the world. And therefore, I started thinking about the way people have been using transformative learning versus the way that Mezirow used perspective transformation. Nobody has ever used the term perspective transformation to refer to anything besides Mezirow's specific theory. But people use transformative learning to refer to any kind of transformation. So it seemed to me that just stick with that. Don't refer to Mezirow's theory as transformative learning. Refer to his theory as perspective transformation. And we have a delineation of terms. We said we're going to use this term for this thing and this other term for this other thing. So we suffer less from this problem of evacuation. And this is, again, what I call if this is my definition of transformative learning, these are my criteria for transformative learning. When somebody claims that they were involved in some kind of learning experience or teaching experience where somebody transformed, I'm looking for, was it really impactful? Was it a minor change or was it a major change? What was the breadth? Did it affect their entire life or did it affect just one small part of their life? And was there relative stability? Was it permanent or at least, non-reversible? All right, so from that, I'm going to go again to this. Remember we came up with these 6 broad categories. So what we wanted to do was create a typology so that if somebody wanted to research or talk about somebody, learners experiencing transformative learning. That I wanted to, based on what research had already done, I wanted to be able to give them a tool that it could say, look for these ways, because it could be that when you're analyzing how you think somebody's changed, you're only approaching it with a few things in mind, and you're going to be blind to a lot of things. But if I gave them a tool that had specific categories and subcategories to kind of say, hey, look for this. Was this there? Was this there? It might help them gain more clarity in how they thought about and how they described transformation. So, the first category was self. So what this is showing here is, in the literature, when people talked about learners changing in dramatic ways, very often they talked about a change in their sense of self. And if you want to read about one scholar that focuses on this is Knud Illerus. He's a retired Danish scholar, has been an educational theorist for a long time, but in the last decade started writing more about transformative learning, and his take on it is transformative learning is really when learning affects your sense of self. And although I disagree in the sense that I think it can be other forms than that, I agree with him that for say something is transformative, I don't see how it doesn't affect your sense of self. Like, it seems like it would almost always be there. So scholars talked about it in this different ways. Some scholars talked about it in the terms of a person's sense of their self in relation to other people or in relation to the world. Like, I felt more connected with others. I felt more at one with the world, or something like that. A lot of transformations involved people gaining a sense of empowerment, where they felt that they were better able to take control of or somehow influence their life. A lot of times with that came a sense of responsibility, a greater responsibility. Sometimes people talked about just changes in identity, just how they viewed themselves or their self-knowledge, realizing something about themselves. Sometimes people change in their personal narrative, meaning, we all have these stories that we tell ourselves about our life and, what our life has been and what things mean. Or in our social interactions, somebody says something and you're like, that feeds into a story, a bigger story. That's how you make sense of those experiences. And sometimes we realize the narratives that we have created aren't very accurate, and we create new narratives. Scholars have talked about people finding new meaning and purpose in their life, and then people especially who approach this from the Jungian psychology with this model of the psyche talk about transformation in terms of a change in personality. Another category was worldview. This is like what Mezirow said, when you challenge your assumptions about the world, your beliefs, your attitudes, your expectations. And sometimes our worldview can change in ways that are very dramatic. This would include another subcategory of interpreting experience, which really can be a couple things. One, it can be thinking back to important experiences from your own history and reinterpreting them based on how you see things now. And it can also mean when you're going your day-to-day life and how you're making sense of the experiences that you have. How are you interpreting those experiences? One thing that Mezirow alluded to that I agree with and others have talked about is that people's worldviews can become more comprehensive or more complex. And that is transformative. And some scholars talk about in terms of gaining new awarenesses or new understandings. And this is more than just learning a new fact. This is kind of like becoming aware of something that you'd never thought of before, you'd never seen before, but now that you think about it, now you can't unsee it, and you see it all around you. And that can be dramatic. That can change in dramatic ways. Another way that people change is in their epistemology. Epistemology is the study of knowledge. What is knowledge, and what can you know, and how do you know it? So when Mezirow talked about creating more discriminating meaning perspectives, he's really talking about change in how you know. What's the criteria for you to believe something? Also, Mezirow talked about being more open, being more accepting of uncertainty was another way that epistemology can change. And I saw those descriptions in other scholars' descriptions of transformation. And then one thing I saw a lot in the literature were scholars talking about extra-rational ways of knowing. So there's, I'm all about rational ways of knowing. I think, learning critical thinking and logic and things like that are very, very helpful. But scholars and researchers said that, if you look at people who develop, let's say, intuitive ways of knowing, where they get more comfortable with what their gut is telling them, which doesn't mean that they only go on their gut and they ignore their rational thinking, but they include it in their repertoire, if you will, of how they understand and make sense of the world and how they make decisions and things like that. So I've heard artists talk about developing an artistic ways of knowing, people somatic ways of knowing, where you get more in tune with your body and what your body is telling you. So what the scholars said is, as people learn and develop habits of using these other ways of knowing, it can have profound effects in how they experience, conceptualize, and interact with the world. The fourth out of 6 ways that people can change is in their ontology. Ontology, if epistemology is a study of knowledge, ontology is a study of being. And so I'm using the term here to mean like how people exist in the world. And this encompasses very kind of different subcategories. So one would be their affective experience of life. If somebody was walking through life feeling depressed or down or guilty or something like that, and then for whatever reason through a process of change, live their moment-to-moment life feeling optimistic and happy and self-accepting, that would be a major change in how their whole lived experience. The second subcategory is ways of being. There were studies that talked about greater self-acceptance or self-compassion, or others talked about a change in dispositions or tendencies, cranky to happy or whatever, or tendencies like what's your knee-jerk reaction to situations. And if that changes, that might be a part of a person's overall change. Another form of ontological change that I've seen in the literature, where people talk about different attributes, like I developed more patience or more resilience or more compassion, I became more attentive, more responsive. But if people develop these attributes profoundly enough, then that can also be a part of the transformational change. And then people who study mindfulness talk about going through life being more aware, so more mindful awareness, which I think would be a transformational change. The fifth category is behavior. This is kind of in my mind, necessary but not sufficient. And what I mean by that is, if somebody said that they transformed and nothing changed about them except they engaged in new behavior, then I would say I don't think that's transformation. But at the same time, if somebody said I transformed, but it didn't affect my behavior, I would call bull on that as well. So I think, in my mind, any transformational change will include behavior. It'll just include other things as well. So when scholars have talked about this in the research literature, most of them talked in terms of that the learner's actions were consistent with their new perspective, that changing their view of the world or whatever changed how they lived in the world, how they behaved, which of course makes sense. A second category, and I include this because I saw it so much in the literature, to me it's really a subcategory that it comes under that first one. But some scholars said that for transformation to really be considered transformation, that people will engage in social action and try to make a world a better place based on their new perspective. So the next one was a real surprise for me. When I saw people describing new professional practices as an outcome of transformative learning, I was thinking, surely you're not telling me that somebody who learns how to work differently has transformed. That just seems like such a minor change. But then it occurred to me that in order for bigger changes to take place, we actually do have to learn skills, which is the fourth one, and those skills in a workplace environment kind of would fall under this professional practices. The codes we came up with were based on what we saw in the literature, so we let some distinctions remain, even though if I were to rewrite this, I might organize them differently. So in these professional practices, I guess it's true, if you develop new ways of engaging in teamwork, and for some reason that was really important and was really profound, and that affected not just how your teams you worked with at work, but also, let's say, your marriage relationship, or how you engaged with others in other contexts, yeah, I guess that would make sense that that would be a part of one's overall transformative experience. But thinking of skills more generally, if you wanted, for instance, if someone, for them to become a critical thinker to where they engaged in an ongoing practice of critical thinking, everything they heard, they assessed it. They didn't just believe it outright, but they engaged in critical thinking and critical thinking about their own thinking. Well, for them to develop those habits, they might have to first learn the skills of critical thinking. So I thought that was important. And the last category was capacity. Sometimes when people talk about transformation, they talked about cognitive development, where people become more mentally complex. Some scholars talked in terms of change of consciousness. These are usually the mindfulness scholars. And others talked about spirituality. And I wasn't sure at first where to put spirituality, but when I read more closely the definitions people offered for it, the scholars in this study talked in terms of feeling a greater sense of becoming more connected to something bigger than themselves. So, to me, of all the categories, it seemed to fit best here. So the research tool that I was hoping to provide for people looks something like this, where I would say, if there's some kind of, if you're looking at somebody who seems to have transformed, then, question, how did they change in terms of their sense of self, especially using the subcategories that might clue you into different ways of thinking about that. And same with worldview and epistemology and ontology, etc. And for each of those things, ask yourself, was this change? Is there evidence that there was a deep impact of it? Is there evidence that it had impact on multiple life contexts, not just one context? And is there evidence that it's somewhat permanent? And so in my mind, these are tools that would help this problem of evacuation. As I opened this presentation with, I'm a huge fan of transformative learning. I think Mesereau's theory is great when it's critiqued. I mean, basically no theory can encompass everything, and I don't think his theory can either, but it's really, really good. But I'm also really appreciative of these other approaches to transformative learning that scholars have talked about. And so I think what's important is to focus on what is the phenomenon that you're interested in as an educator, as a researcher, or whatever, and then just be really careful about the terms you use. And if we're talking about transformation, then these can be tools to help you articulate exactly what it is you mean by that term. Anyway, that's it. Hope you enjoyed it.